Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you please take your seats for the fourth plenary session, which will be starting in 1 or 2 minutes' time. The theme for the fourth plenary session is a new Cold War in Asia. The focus is very much on the geopolitical dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region. By way of background, I should say that earlier this year, the IISS organized for the 13th time the annual Shangri-La Dialogue Conference in Singapore for defense ministers from 27 Asia-Pacific countries and from other states with vital interests in the security of the Asia-Pacific region. This year's Shangri-La Dialogue was distinguished, I think, by the robustness and the directness of the exchanges that took place there, and particularly the forthright response of the Chinese PLA's Deputy Chief of General Staff to the keynote address by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and also the address by US Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. Many of us who were present at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue thought that the discussions there quite accurately reflected what have in recent years been growing strategic tensions in the region. These tensions have been most apparent around China's maritime littoral, where China's assertion of territorial claims in the East China Sea and the South China Sea has brought it into a confrontation with Japan and several Southeast Asian states, respectively. The United States, as the Asia-Pacific region's balancing power and as a security partner of Japan and several Southeast Asian states, is also, of course, an important part of the regional strategic equation. Indeed, I think it's true that from China's perspective, the American rebalance to the Asia-Pacific over the last several years is an important cause of insecurity in the region. These regional strategic tensions have raised the question for some observers of whether a new Cold War is emerging in the Asia-Pacific. And to discuss this vitally important question this morning, our panel comprises, on my far left, Mr. Ichita Yamamoto, who until very recently was a minister in the Japanese government led by Shinzo Abe. Among Mr. Yamamoto's responsibilities were ocean policy and territorial issues, so he is particularly well qualified and well equipped to address the question of Asia's regional security dynamics. Secondly, on my right, from China, Mr. Eric Li, who is chairman of Chengwei Capital. He is a member of the International Advisory Council of the IISS, and he describes himself as a political scientist as well as a venture capitalist. He has notably argued in a TED lecture recently and elsewhere that the claim of Western democracies to the universality of their political systems is going to be morally challenged by China. And finally, on my immediate left, Sarah Raine, who is Consulting Senior Fellow for Geo-Economics and Security with the IISS. Sarah is now based in Berlin, but she was formerly my colleague in the IISS Asia office in Singapore. She is the co-author of a fairly recent IISS Adelphi book on the South China Sea disputes, having earlier written another Adelphi book on China-Africa relations. What the running order for this plenary session will be, first of all, Yamamoto-san, and then Eric Li, and thirdly, Sarah. So, Mr. Yamamoto.
Thank you, Dr. Huxley. I am Ichita Yamamoto, former Japanese Minister for Ocean Policy and Territorial Issues. I served as the minister from the beginning of the current Abe administration in December 2012 until a few weeks ago when the Prime Minister reshuffled the cabinet. While no longer a minister, I am proud to be the first Japanese parliamentarian to participate as a speaker in a session at the IISS Global Strategic Review, My thanks goes to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, giving me an opportunity to speak in Oslo, a beautiful and vibrant growing city with one of the highest quality of life in the world. I was also very much impressed by the fact that Mr. Eric Lee, a well-known debater, knows that I am a singer-songwriter. I'm very much looking forward to discussing with Mr. Lee and Ms. Raine on this very difficult issue. Let me start by reiterating that Prime Minister Abe is not a militarist, as some of the media insinuate. I can assure you that such perceptions of Prime Minister Abe are totally unfounded. I have spent 18 years working close with Mr. Shinzo Abe, and I know him very well personally. I have no doubt that Prime Minister Abe is determined to pursue the path of peace-loving nation, which Japan has consistently followed since the end of World War II. Needless to mention, Prime Minister Abe attaches great importance to bilateral relations with neighboring countries in Asia, particularly China and Korea. Since the inception of the Abe administration, Japan has changed. Most Japanese now feel the sense of positive change with the strong leadership of Prime Minister Abe, and we have started to regain confidence. The Abe administration, with its high approval rating, is now, therefore, one of the most stable governments in the world. Its approval rating has increased even more after the cabinet reshuffle in the beginning of this month. Oh my God, without me. As you know very well, the security landscape in Asia and Europe has increasingly become more volatile. Japan views the situation in Ukraine as a global issue that would have a grave impact on the rule of law, providing the integrity and protecting the sovereignty of each nation in the present world. This is why Japan, unlike most of other Asian countries, has acted in concert with G7 countries by imposing sanctions against Russia and also providing economic assistance of $1.5 billion to Ukraine. The situation in Ukraine, as symbolized by the annexation of Crimea, has similar threads in the situation in the East and South China Sea. In both seas, there have been frequent attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by force or coercion. In the East China Sea, we have seen persistent intrusions into Japan's territorial waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands. In November 2013, the world was stunned by the unilateral declaration of establishing an Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, that unduly infringed on the freedom of overflight on the high seas in the East China Sea. The number of times that self-defense force aircraft scrambled in response to military aircraft approaching our territorial airspace has now reached unprecedented levels in recent years. In the South China Sea as well, there have been a series of actions based on unilateral claims, some resulting in physical clashes between the countries involved, and a sense of urgent vigilance is mounting among the countries. The fundamental issue that we face in those situations is an attempt to change the status quo by force or coercion. Such unilateral attempts are serious challenges to the rule of law and can no longer be limited to bilateral issues. How to address such behavior is a common challenge facing the international community. With such a sense of urgency, Prime Minister Abe has repeatedly called for the importance of strengthening the rule of law and of not condoning any attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion in order to maintain the peace and the prosperity of the world. In recent months, Prime Minister Abe made such an appeal at the North Atlantic Council in Brussels, at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, and other fora. I think his message was well received by those audiences to the effect that it has become globally recognized. The theme of the session today is a new Cold War in Asia, ? I understand that some people like to view the current situation in Asia, especially in the East and South China Seas, as the beginning of a new Cold War. I disagree with such views. At the same time, I strongly believe that we are standing at the watershed, a fork in the road, where we may have to decide the future orientation of the international order in the 21st century. Either to seek a peaceful change building upon the post-World War II international order based on the rule of law, or to allow those who utilize their aggrieved status in the present international order to undermine and eventually transform that order in their favor. In today's intertwined world, emerging threats have forced a rethinking of traditional approaches to security. At the same time, any threats, irrespective of where they originate in the world, could have a direct influence on the security of any nation. A case in point is North Korea. North Korea's provocative activities involve the risk of global proliferation of nuclear materials and related technologies to third countries. This is no longer an issue confronting East Asia alone, but rather a critical challenge facing the international community. In such security environment, no nation can secure its own peace only by itself. Coordination with allies and partners, as well as within international forums such as the United Nations, has become increasingly significant. Based on such perception, Japan is willing to bear its burden for peace as a proactive contributor to peace, while coordinating with other countries, including the United States and the European nations, sharing the fundamental values. In this regard, the government of Japan has taken measures to strengthen its security posture and prepare itself toward that aim. A historic cabinet decision for drafting new legislation, including those for collective self-defense this July, is one of such undertakings. Japan has made considerable contributions to the peace and development of East Asia and the world for almost 70 years since the end of World War II, as a nation anchored on peaceful orientation, democracy, and the rule of law. Looking forward, Japan, under Prime Minister Abe's leadership, will seek to build upon existing international and regional order through peaceful means based on the universal values. The criticisms expressed against Japan's recent efforts, such as militarization of Japan or tilting to the right, are completely unfounded and misguided. I would now like to turn your attention again to the importance of maritime security for the peace and prosperity of the world. Prime Minister Abe proposed 3 principles of the rule of law at sea in his keynote address at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in May. His principles reiterate that in order to maintain maritime security, states need to make their claims based on international law. They shall not use force or coercion in trying to drive their claims in the sea, and they shall seek to settle disputes by peaceful means. It was no coincidence that on the occasion of the Fullerton Lecture organized by IISS this January, well before Prime Minister Abe's keynote address, I proposed Yamamoto's 3 principles in dealing with the situation surrounding Japan's territorial integrity. Yamamoto's 3 principles are the rule of law, the promotion of bilateral relationship with our neighbors, and the strengthening of the regional community. What I intended to reiterate through Yamamoto's 3 principles is the importance of promoting bilateral relationship with our neighbors and strengthening the regional community. Issue of territorial integrity should not be allowed to overly affect the bilateral relationships with neighboring countries. Let me touch upon Japan's relations with China and South Korea, the closest countries to Japan, both geographically and culturally. Japan has attached great importance to the development of our relationship with both countries. In fact, Japan has played a significant role in the economic development of both China and the Republic of Korea. Japan has consistently supported China's and Korea's development since the normalization of diplomatic relations. In the case of China, over the decades, China has received more than $40 billion in official development assistance from Japan to develop modern infrastructure, modern hospitals, and cutting-edge devices to preserve the environment. The Japanese private sector has also played a prominent role through direct investment, technology transfer, and worker training in the development of the Chinese economy. In the Asian financial crisis of 1997, Japan helped China and Korea, along with other Asian countries, to overcome the crisis through, among others, creating swap currency mechanisms. At the same time, I am appalled to hear the allegation that Japan is the one who tries to change the status quo of the international order, internationally mixing up the territorial issues and issues of recognition of history. I'd like to stress that the legal issue of territorial integrity and those of the recognition of the history should be treated as a separate issues that should not be confused. China is now the second largest economy in the world. In the last couple of decades, China has grown into a greater power, and there's no doubt that China will have great influence on the prosperity and the stability of the region and the world. Japan is not trying to stand against China. Rather, as we have done in the past, we are making efforts to work with China as a more responsible member of the international community to contribute for the peace and stability of the Asia. Japan believes it is truly important for the countries concerned to engage in meaningful dialogue in order to solve any issues that arise among them. Japan's door to dialogue is always open to neighbors, including China, at any level. Quite recently, Japan-China and Japan-Korea foreign ministers met bilaterally in an informal or formal setting at the margin of ASEAN Regional Forum. I hope that such moves will be the beginning of the thaw in Japan's relation with China and Korea. In that vein, I sincerely hope that the Beijing APEC Summit and East Asia Summit in November will be a great success, providing leaders with a venue to discuss the challenges facing the region in a candid and cooperative manner. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yamamoto. I'm very struck by your emphasis on 3 points. Yamamoto's 3 principles: the rule of law, promotion of bilateral relations in the region, and strengthening of the regional community. I think we'll come back to discussing those points later. I now ask Mr. Eric Lee to speak.
Good morning, thank you. I'm Eric Lee from Shanghai. I'd like to start with a confession first. I'm a fan of Yamamoto-san. Not on the grounds of international relations, but on something much more universal for the human condition: music. If you don't know, you should Google him. He's literally a rock star.
Thank you very much.
At the beginning, I've invited Yamamoto-san to come perform in Shanghai for one of my companies called Youku, which is the largest video sharing, video, TV, online video company in China, second largest in the world, 650 million viewers. And he has graciously accepted. Thank you. Second, I'd like to share a secret with you. It's confidential. There's no such thing as Asia. It doesn't exist. It is an arbitrarily drawn space on a map that its essence doesn't exist as Europe exists and not even as Latin America exists. So I think we ought to consider, is there going to be a Cold War in Asia? We should consider that issue with that in mind. And today I'd like to consider that issue at 3 different levels. First, the global context. Second, a historic perspective. And third, strategic imperatives. First, China views its position and strategies in Asia only in the global context for the reason I mentioned. And what is that global context? First and foremost, the United States of America, China's largest partner and competitor in the world in just about everything. They, of course, differ in one crucial respect. The US is the current dominant world power that leads a global architecture that encompasses all aspects of world affairs: political, economic, military, and even cultural. The United States led the design and building of this global architecture after World War II and after the Cold War, and the Asia-Pacific is a part of that architecture. And China is a rapidly rising power that only became the powerhouse it is now in the past generation. Now, first, I'd like to make a quick stop, and I want to correct one misperception that's being reported around the world. If you open the newspaper, you will think that's what's going on, but it is not. China does not view the United States as an enemy. It's the biggest misperception out there. And I don't think the US views China as an enemy. These 2 countries are extraordinarily intertwined, and we can go into that at a later stage. Now, back to the post-Cold War global architecture. It seems to be breaking down. It is breaking down for 2 reasons. One, the United States is in trouble, if you haven't heard. It is suffering from internal contradictions and the grave consequences of external overreach. The internal difficulties are perhaps the most serious America has faced in 100 years, and they are structural. And external overreach in the past 25 years have led to failures and exhaustion. 2, the so-called the rise of the rest, of which China is the most prominent one. America's share of the world's GDP has materially declined, and this trend will continue. Now, when you're the dominant shareholder, I'm a venture capitalist, I use those terms. When you're a dominant shareholder of a company, let's say you own 80%, you act in the best interest of the company. But when you own 30%, you act more in your own best interest. And of course, the rest are making claims that are often in conflict with the way the global architecture is set up. Next, the historic perspective is also important in our understanding and assessment of the current state of affairs. China, the second largest economy and soon to surpass the US as the largest economy in the world, did not participate in the design and establishment of the current global architecture. It has benefited tremendously by taking advantage of the system for its own development. But that does not take away from the implications of the fact that China's interests were never taken into account in the design and building of the current system. One example is the US-led alliance system, that is the backbone of the global architecture and its manifestation in the Asia-Pacific. Now, many have argued that China, being so big now, must act as a responsible stakeholder in the world, as Yamamoto-san mentioned. Of course, that is correct in principle, but there is an inherent contradiction we should be aware of in the notion that someone is being asked to act as a stakeholder in a system that he did not participate in designing and building, and its constitution does not take its interests into consideration. Next, the strategic imperative. China's strategies in the Asia-Pacific are based on its assessment of geopolitical, economic, and military realities. The global architecture cannot be sustained as is. Yet the current architecture, like any other complex institutions, is inherently rigid and cannot adapt to change. As a result, the United States is very, very busy and very, very tired at the same time. The pivot to Asia says it all. By definition, one can only pivot in one direction at a time. A couple of years ago, it was a pivot to Asia. Now, of course, we got problems in Russia and Ukraine. Then again, the Middle East. It makes it very difficult for the boss of the system to sustain a long-term strategy in a particular region. China, of course, does have a long-term strategic objective. It is to reclaim a preeminent position in Asia. Given its history and its current position, it is an understandable objective and a wholly justified aspiration. Now, in order to do that, it must seek adjustments to the current global architecture in Asia, and this, of course, gives rise to tensions. Many say that China's assertive moves in recent years in Asia, in East Asia and Southeast Asia, have hurt its position. Many of the neighbors have now moved closer to the US in opposition to China. Now, I disagree with that assessment. One cannot get a bigger pie, bigger share of the pie, and at the same time have everyone else happily oblige. I don't know about you, I've never experienced that in the business world. In 25 years as a capitalist, I've never walked into a boardroom and said, I think I deserve a higher percentage share in this company, and have everyone else clap and say, wonderful, take some more. It doesn't happen. So tension is natural. Now, when you try to get a bigger share of the pie, the upside is the bigger share, and the downside, of course, is the total breakdown, which destroys the pie itself. In this case, will be military conflict. Now, the very essence of strategy is to balance upside and downside and optimize your interests. So on that ground, it seems to me that China has performed rather brilliantly in recent years. The objective is to realize adjustments to the status quo in its favor without leading to war. In both the South China Sea against the Philippines and the East China Sea vis-à-vis Japan, China has achieved that objective. In East China Sea, with regards to Diaoyu Sankaku Islands, the status quo was Japan's denial of the existence of dispute and its near complete administrative control there. Now, China's moves have made dispute a reality, and its presence there also a reality. But no war. In the South China Sea again, China's presence near Huangyan Island has altered the status quo in its favor. But no war. In this respect, I think China holds a significant strategic advantage over, say, Japan. You see, China is an independent player, and Japan is not. Japan is part and parcel to the US-led global architecture and is locked into its alliance system. For instance, Japan has worked very hard to make nice with Russia. For several years, it was a priority strategy. Yet, once Ukraine happened, the strategy collapsed because it had to go with the priorities of the Western alliance. So Japan's priorities are subservient to a larger alliance. And China, on the contrary, has wide room for maneuvering, but Japan is boxed in. At the strategic level, while Japan's counterparty may be China, China's counterparty is always the United States of America. Now, this is Chinese anger towards Japan on historic grounds is genuine, but it is a moral imperative, not a strategic point. Between China and the United States, the US is, of course, much more powerful than China in all respects. But it is not when considering the size of their respective objectives at the moment. China's objectives in Asia are modest relative to its national capabilities. It's punching below its weight. America's objectives in the world are enormous compared to its national capabilities and the internal problems it faces. It's punching above its weight. It is in that context China will execute its strategies, and the longer-term result will be qualitative recalculations by China's neighbors in the region. So is there a Cold War emergent? I don't think so. In Asia, China is deeply engaged with all its neighbors, including Japan, at all levels. It doesn't mean there will be no tension and unhappiness as China gradually gains a bigger share of the pie. But it's not a Cold War. The term Cold War, of course, reminds us of the struggle between America and the Soviet Union. Now, in the world at large, again, China is totally different from the Soviet Union. China is deeply integrated in the world economy. In fact, it is the largest trading nation in the world and in history. China's engagement with the United States is extraordinary in breadth and depth and scale. America's future generations depend on China's stability and prosperity, and vice versa. I argue that never in the history of the world have two countries been so interdependent on each other as America and China are today. Are there risks? Of course. There could be accidents, unpredictable events. Now, I want to also correct a couple of misperceptions on how to deal with the issues at hand. First is the notion of the law, the so-called rule of law. Prime Minister Abe made that his centerpiece of his address in Singapore a few months ago. Of course, people refer to UNCLOS, and I heard UNCLOS over and over again in Singapore 3 months ago. I finally went back to Shanghai and I read the thing. Page to page, every page. And to those of you who are interested in being tortured, I recommend it highly. But you know what I discovered? UNCLOS does not address the issues at hand, which is a sovereignty dispute. UNCLOS does not address it. In fact, if you read history, when UNCLOS was set up, it specifically went around the issue of historical titles. Otherwise, the law would never have come into existence. Of course, sovereignty issues is fundamentally a political issue. That is why the UNCLOS provides a specific opt-out for countries that do not want the law to become a circus. And China has taken that option. For instance, the ADIZ issue, Yamamoto-san mentioned. There is no law in the book that would prevent China from establishing ADIZ. So to mention ADIZ alongside law is disingenuous, to say the least. And let me remind everyone that Japan has the largest ADIZ in Asia, period. China's ADIZ is very, very modest compared with Japan's, even more modest when taking into consideration the size of China's land mass and Japan's. In fact, China's ADIZ that was declared only stretches a few hundred miles from Shanghai and Beijing, its industrial and political center, while Japan's ADIZ at the furthest stretches well over 1,000 miles from Japan's political and industrial centers. But there's no law to prevent Japan from doing that. Of course, and Japan's ADIZ has been enlarged multiple times in the past decades, every time unilaterally without making a call to anybody, maybe to America. So I think there are rhetorics, but if we want to resolve issues, we need to be clear-headed. But short of accidents, we need to be patient. The global architecture is by definition rigid. It is difficult to make adjustments. Adjustments may be painful. And we're in the process of a long and complex negotiation between China and America. But China's strategies and America's own interests and their interdependence will lead to the gradual emergence of a new configuration. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. As I read the lineup of this panel upon receipt of the invitation to speak from IISS, I was immediately reminded of an article written back in 2012 by two Chinese scholars, Yan Xuetong and Shi Haxia, which analyzed and, on balance, rejected the prospects for a new Cold War in Asia. And it was entitled Football Game Rather Than Boxing Match. Now, given the recent tensions between China and Japan, I confess to wondering myself what sort of panel, what sort of sport this panel was going to more closely resemble. And so I was pleased to hear the comments from our two distinguished, excellent speakers prior to me, and find that, on balance, I'm probably participating in something more akin to a football game. Now, I do, however, need to start off on a little bit of a contrarian note, because I, like Yamamoto-san and Mr. Lee, I'm not particularly sure that the conception of a new Cold War is a particularly useful framework for understanding developments in Asia today. There are, of course, some parallels, not least my desire on hearing Mr. Lee talk about the normality of tensions, with which I totally agree, to quote Reagan at you, that peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the absence of war. Nevertheless, my concern is that going too far down the track of trying to draw parallels somehow runs the risk of either misrepresenting the past or misinterpreting the present. There are several differences that can and already have been highlighted: the multipolarity of the different actors shaping the environment in Asia today, or indeed the array of tensions that we see on display, that include, of course, tensions within ASEAN, the special set of tensions raised by the DPRK and its nuclear capabilities, and so on. Likewise, as Mr. Lee noticed, the predominant discourse of today is still talk about socialization, adaptation, integration. And then you compare this with the infamous NSC 68, the US National Security Council document of 1950, which basically set the seeds of US Cold War strategy for the next 2 decades, with its talk of fostering the seeds of destruction of the Soviet system. And I just don't see any of that going on in US, China, or indeed Japanese strategy today. Importantly also, economic ties no longer faithfully overlap with security interests. So in 1979, which was the last year of détente, US-Soviet trade stood at a historic peak of 1% of the total volume of US global trade. Today, even on the back of all these disputes that we're hearing about, China remains Japan's leading trading partner, and Japan, alongside the EU, a leading foreign direct investor in China. Indeed, even the ambition to negotiate something akin to a regional comprehensive economic partnership, which includes the likes of China, India, South Korea, Japan, and others, I'm not sure would have found any traction in the Cold War Asia. So whilst we could go further down this track, the concern is that it actually distracts from what, at least I understand from Tim, my brief to be, which is to look at what the strategic situation in Asia actually is today, and therefore what policies we could be formulating in order to manage the evident tensions. And of course, just because we're not witnessing a new Cold War in Asia doesn't mean that we're not entering a worrying period of heightened and growing rivalry and competition with multiple potential flashpoints. So over the last few years, we have seen in Asia's maritime theatre in general and in the disputed island groupings contained therein in particular, emerging as a sort of front line, if you like, of growing tensions. These sovereignty disputes, whether in the South or East China Sea, are long-standing in nature, but the manner of their prosecution is altering significantly, in part because of the challenges we're seeing to UNCLOS. And you heard Mr. Lee correctly say that UNCLOS doesn't have a recipe for the answers of exactly who owns what particular set of islands. What it does is suggest a set of rules for managing freedom of navigation at sea, and it's those that appear at some times to be under challenge now. Destabilizing activities, as well as reckless actions which threaten through accident rather than through design, have increasingly been on display in Asia's seas and the airspace above them. They've involved the deployment of military capabilities, of fishermen, and even oil rigs. So think, just for example, about the standoff between China and the Philippines at the Scarborough Shoal, or this year's altercations at Second Thomas Shoal, of allegations of Chinese naval ships locking fire control radar on a Chinese helicopter and vessel over the East China Sea, or dangerous close-quarter maneuvers, USS Cowpens in December 2013, the recent intercept of a US Navy patrol aircraft by an armed Chinese fighter jet. It's of course important to acknowledge that the government in Beijing is far from the only government in the region whose actions don't always appear consistently formulated to make conflict less likely. So where does this all end up? And what policies, strategies should we be considering to manage these growing tensions? Let me just offer three key areas, questions if you like, that I think should be central in the formulation of strategies for this region, along with a brief thought on each. And the first question, put in admittedly the most simplistic terms for the sake of time, I think is by far the most important, and it is this. To what extent are the tensions we are witnessing in Asia the result of what is at heart a security dilemma based around the challenges of accommodating a rapidly rising power within the existing international order? Or, to what extent is this rising power a revisionist power in the sense that it seeks fundamentally to redraw borders within Asia and to ensure, if you like, that its interests are taken into account not so much within the existing international order, adapting that existing international order, but by the creation of a new one and the rejection of the current one that has served Asia so well in terms of peace, security, and development, and indeed enabled China's rise over this last 60 years. Now, of course, if what we're looking at is at heart a security dilemma, whereby powers feel threatened by each other, but neither seek themselves to threaten, then the policies of strategic reassurance are naturally going to take center stage. If, on the other hand, what we're faced with are powers that are more revisionist in the sense I've described, then efforts to promote CBMs, improved transparency, or any of the other measures involved in strategic reassurance are unlikely to achieve the desired outcome. And therefore, we're moving to a shift in policies that focus more around deterrence. Now, the jury, of course, at the moment is conveniently out on which of these two Asias, or to put it more bluntly, two Chinas, is emerging. Certainly, I believe that a very convincing case can still be made for tensions stemming predominantly from some sort of security dilemma. And here I would commend to you an excellent recent book by Jim Steinberg and Mike O'Hanlon, which basically presents as good an argument as I have seen as the raft of domestic and international factors driving different powers in Asia towards competition, and a selection of confidence-building measures that could and should be deployed in order to counter these. But yet, as the list I gave earlier of potentially destabilizing Chinese actions indicates, there are also worrying signs appearing that China might be working to a more revisionist agenda. And if you listen to Mr. Li, that this agenda is effectively Chinese hegemony in Asia, and the reactions that this is likely to provoke, and then we all need to be doing a lot more hard thinking about the parameters or otherwise of this acceptability and the deterrence measures that might be deployable against any actions that lie outside of those parameters. Now, my second question, and my attempt to make myself equally unpopular with both panelists, would be the extent to which Japan can project itself as a consistent, reliable, and attractive partner for other Asian states. Because there's no doubt of the developing diplomatic competition for influence between China and Japan. It's no accident that Prime Minister Abe's first overseas trip upon his re-election is to Southeast Asia, or that, for the first time this year, investment from Japan in Southeast Asia overtook Japan's foreign investments in China. And in the wake of Tokyo's decision in April of this year to end its ban on arms exports, we can expect to see Japan's security engagement in the region being boosted, as witnessed, for example, by the proposed sale of 6 maritime surveillance vessels to Vietnam. A note, if you like, on China as an independent player and Japan is not, with Japan as subservient in the Western alliance, as witnessed by Japan's sanctioning of Russia. I mean, again, this is elements of interpretation, and it depends if you define independence and subservience, at least in my perspective, as upholding the rule of international law and the right of one sovereign country not to have its territory invaded by another. At least that's how I personally would see things. Nevertheless, for Japan to become a truly reliable and attractive partner within Asia, it won't be enough to do the fabulous job that Yamamoto-san has clearly done in explaining Japan's modified security posture, because its leaders are going to have to deal more consistently and sensitively with their country's past. Irreversible steps to recognize historical tragedies surely need to become imaginable. Whether that be, just for example, imagine a memorial to enslaved comfort women in Tokyo, or a commitment, public or private, henceforth to make commemorations at Budokan Stadium or Chudogore-Fachi Cemetery, rather than Yasukuni, the centerpiece of World War II remembrances attended by Japan's most senior politicians. And a final brief question and thought relates to ASEAN and its ability to rise above the differences that still divide it in order more proactively to shape its security environment, its strategic neighborhood. For whilst individual states, such as Singapore, may well be operating to a strategic agenda which aims proactively to influence the context in which great power rivalry is played out, the dangers of a divide and rule strategy on behalf of China are obvious. Yet for too long now, ASEAN as a collective body has seemed somewhat stuck on increasingly bland reaffirmations of stalled dialogues, such as the effort to develop a code of conduct for parties in the South China Sea, which was signed up to back in 2002, and the clock is still ticking. So there, if you like, are my 3 guiding questions. And of course, there are always more that could be posed with regard to the US, DPRK, etc. But a very brief word on the costs involved before I conclude. And I think that on the costs involved with getting this wrong, well, on the 100th anniversary of World War I, which of course began with an unexpected assassination of an archduke, the worst case scenario is clear. I do, however, think there are scenarios in which any conflict could be confined to just the bilateral, whether between China and Japan or China and a rival claimant in the South China Sea. Indeed, US military intelligence analysts have gone on record with their assessment that Chinese exercises have been focused precisely around the sort of short, sharp war aimed at creating a fait accompli on the ground, in this case probably an island, which would leave little time for a sort of kinetic military response. But even this more limited skirmish would have fundamental consequences for the regional order, which in itself, I suppose, is part of the attraction potentially to a Chinese leader if they were to be under serious domestic pressure. Likewise, a failed Chinese military assault, on the other hand, could again have serious consequences, not least in terms of the credibility of the Chinese Communist Party, with similarly dramatic consequences for the regional order. Nevertheless, under caution myself to respect the rule of law, in this case in terms of IISS's timekeeping, I will end my comments there. And since it appears that I have basically ended up answering a question with 3 more questions, I'll look forward to Tim opening up this session to your answers from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your very balanced and your very balanced and sensible assessment. Well, I think there's unanimity that there is no emergent Cold War as such in the Asia-Pacific region, but nevertheless it is evident that there are important and potentially dangerous tensions in Asia. The central question seems to be how to manage those tensions. Now, we have just over 15 minutes for the discussion session, and we need to bring this plenary session to a close promptly at 12:15, not least because Yamamoto-san has an airplane to catch. So I think we'll take one round of 4 or 5 questions. And I see, first of all, Sanjaya Baru.
Thank you, Tim. My question is to Mr. Lee. You began by asserting that there is no Asia, and then you ended up by saying that China's goal is to seek a preeminent position in Asia. So what is this Asia you're talking about? East Asia, Southeast Asia, or Asia as is being suggested by the topic of the day? My second brief question is, you referred to the moral aspect of China's anger with Japan rather than political or strategic. But why did the moral issue not come up in the 90s when China was the largest recipient of Japanese foreign direct investment and aid?
Thank you very much, Sanjaya. Mr. Harries.
Thank you very much. Matthew Harries from King's College London and shortly IISS. One of the features of the Cold War, the first Cold War, was a preoccupation with the transfer of reputational concerns from one region to another. So I'd like to ask Mr. Yamamoto what lessons Japan has learnt, if any, from the crisis in Ukraine, either about the resolve of the United States or about the use of economic instruments in deterrence or norm reinforcement, or about the possible response to actions in the so-called grey zone between war and peace. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Christian Lemire.
Thank you, Tim. A question for Mr. Lee. As a recent reader of UNCLOS, could you clarify whether you think China's 9-dash line is in line with China's very clear rules on maritime zones that can be claimed from land areas? And secondly, you talk about China trying to gain a preeminent position within Asia or even globally, but it seems to be predicated on an optimistic assessment of China's continued growth, almost in a linear fashion. Do you think there may be any bumps in the road for China's economic and therefore strategic growth in the future?
Thanks, Christian. William Chung.
Thank you, Tim. William from the IISS. Question for Eric Lee. Completely understand your position that China intends to grab a bigger piece of the pie. But we can see that in its process of grabbing a bigger piece of the pie, as you state, it's led to greater tensions. And essentially what we see is the Chinese game of chicken in the Asia-Pacific. So what do you say when there's a reconstituted Chinese sphere of influence in the South China Sea, East China Sea, somewhat analogous to your 9-dash line, to see many unhappy constituents in the Chinese empire that is about to emerge in this part of the world? Thank you.
Thanks, William. Takashi Maeda.
Thank you. My question is going to Mr. Lee, that you talk about that your Chinese counterpart is only in the United States, but this rhetoric is the same rhetoric that North Korea is using in its nuclear deal, rather than the six-party talk. And on the other hand, you said that China is now using a different rhetoric in terms of maritime security in the South China Sea against ASEAN countries. China is going to deal with a bilaterally on each country by country rather than the ASEAN. So what is the difference between the two rhetoric?
Thank you. Ms. Ekborg.
Thank you. Katarina Engberg, Swedish Ministry of Defense. I have a question for Mr. Lee. What are the changes to the current architecture that China is likely to seek in its negotiations primarily with the US?
Thank you. Mr. Raman.
From Yamashita principle to the Yamamoto principle, quite impressed. Very briefly, I have problems in agreeing with what Mr. Lee has suggested in his brilliant exposition of the position of China. UNCLOS has helped Bangladesh, a small country, to resolve the problems of maritime boundary with India and Myanmar precisely through the UNCLOS. And the opt-out clause in the UNCLOS, with which I was deeply involved, does not particularly give the permission to any country to go and occupy or kind of threaten or whatever, just to make sure that there is no war. There is a war, it doesn't mean that there is peace. Absence of war is not peace. So that is something I would like to hear from Mr. Lee.
Thank you very much. And finally, Professor Schaffer.
Teresita Schaefer from Brookings and McLarty Associates. This is really an extension of Sanjay Baru's question. I wonder if all of the participants could say where India figures in their discussions of tensions in Asia, and more broadly, where the Indian Ocean region figures in this.
Thank you. We have eight questions there. That's quite a lot for our panelists to deal with, and so I'll give each of them the chance to respond to whichever of the questions they feel best equipped to answer. And I think starting with Eric Lee, and then Yamamoto-san, and then Sarah to wrap up. So, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. First of all, when I said Asia does not exist, of course I was speaking metaphorically. It, of course, does exist on the ground. But I was making a point that it is qualitatively different from the way Europe exists or America exists. It is a qualitatively different, and we need to consider that in that context. In terms of UNCLOS and the 9-dash line, the 9-dash line has a long history, much, much longer than UNCLOS, decades longer. Even, I think it was before, after World War II, the ROC government put out a 9-dash line, maybe I think it was 12-dash line or something like that. So this has been a long-running dispute that predated UNCLOS, and UNCLOS does not deal with a 9-dash line. UNCLOS does not deal with sovereignty issues. I cannot find, I read it, I cannot find anywhere in there that deals with sovereignty issues, that like who should own what. In terms of the China's trajectory, speaking as a businessman, I am cautiously optimistic. The next phase of Chinese growth is not going to be double-digit growth like the past 20, 30 years. But I think China could comfortably grow at 7 to 8% for the next generation by about 20 years. And it will surpass the US as the largest economy probably within a few years, maybe 5 years, 6, 7 years. It is already this year the largest economy in the world on purchasing power parity, according to the World Bank data. So I think that will continue. The absence of war is not peace. I think the absence of war is peace. I don't know how else to put it logically. If there's no war, there is peace. There's tensions, but tension doesn't mean there's no peace. A peaceful environment always has tension. ASEAN. Of course, China wants to deal with individual countries in ASEAN bilaterally because they could get a better deal that way. They're not stupid. Thank you.
Are there any other questions you want to ask? I'm not sure. Is there any other?
One more thing I want to, with regards to the first question and several others afterwards, I believe I said China's objective is to reclaim a preeminent position in Asia. I believe I did not say the preeminent position. If I said the preeminent position, I stand corrected. I mean a preeminent position. But I believe I did say a preeminent position. Thank you.
So does that imply a willingness to share the preeminent position?
Well, of course, by definition.
Okay. Yeah. Yamamoto-san.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Huxley. Before answering the question about Ukraine, I want to make some comments regarding the presentation made by Mr. Lee. He pointed out that Chinese air defense identification zone is modest. Japanese ADIZ is larger than that of China's. But the point is not the size of the ADIZ. The concept that Chinese government trying to bring about as a AIDZ is very much different that of AIDZ, which was used in our context. Well, China tried to unduly, infringe on the freedom of flight on the high seas in the East China Sea, which is against the principle of international law. That's one point which I'd like to make. And also, Mr. Lee's presentation was very clear, powerful, but I cannot agree with him that he's saying that China has achieved its objective, in East China Sea and South China Sea without a war. But I think it's a very dangerous game. Well, according to a very recent poll conducted by a Japanese non-profit organization, more than 93% of Japanese, I was stunned, have a negative image about China. This sentiment of Japanese toward China has been deteriorated in last 2 years, especially after when the Chinese ship intrude into the territorial water of Japan surrounding Senkaku Islands and intentionally, clashed with the Japanese Coast Guard vessel. I am a bit afraid that this kind of, sentiment, unhealthy, nationalism. If unhealthy nationalism flares up, it will become, kind of situation which is very difficult to control. So I think, I'm a bit worried about his way of putting that China has, achieved its objective without a war. I think I very much worried. The most important thing between China and Japan at this moment is to make efforts to avoid unexpected conflicts. That's the reason why Japanese government has been asking China to establish a kind of mechanism, some kind of mechanism for preventing and avoiding unexpected crash or collision, which may lead to a real, conflict. For instance, through creating a maritime communication mechanism. And I think, not only in the water, I think, the space, airspace over the Senkaku Islands is more, dangerous. And also, so these are things which I want to make a comment on Mr. Lee's, presentation. And what Japan has learned from the lesson of Ukraine. I have to, make a short speech. I'm sorry on my English. But anyway, the most important thing which Japan learned from the Ukraine issue is that we should never allow any country to change the status quo by force or coercion. That is the reason why Japan decided to participate in the sanction against Russia, in spite of the fact that Prime Minister Abe has, been maintaining a very good relations with President Putin. Not because the United States asked Japan to do that. I, feel also a little bit uneasiness when I learned that Chinese opinion leaders, including, Mr. Lee, believe that, Chinese, how do you say that, tacit support to Russia in the context of Crimea issue is consistent with the Chinese long-term strategic, thinking. I think this kind of worldview is a bit dangerous because it doesn't reflect the basic, fundamental, values such as the rule of law, democracy, and human rights, and particularly human-centered ideas such as human security.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Sarah, you can you have the chance to try and
three very quick
wrap
points.
up.
One, a direct answer to your interesting question on where India sits in all of this. Prime Minister Modi's first visit outside of the Indian subcontinent was a 5-day visit to Japan. Prime Minister Modi is one of only 4 people that Prime Minister Abe follows on Twitter, at least the last time I checked.
You to follow him.
Yeah. And during that visit, we saw an upgrade of India-Japan US trilateral talks to foreign minister level, defense cooperation memo, so quite some substance to a cultivation, if you like, of Prime Minister Modi that has been going on since his days as first chief minister in Gujarat. Of course, we have now had the visit of President Xi to New Delhi. There was an interesting op-ed authored by Xi in The Hindu, which talked about the economics alliances, if you like, between China and India. India is the backroom office and China is the factory of the world. But when I look at the substance in terms of foreign defense policy, strategic view of the world, I still see some considerable differences there. Secondly, on Ukraine, if I may, there is a lot we could say on China, of course, and attitudes and interests in what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. But one just general reminder, in case any of us need it reminding, one lesson of Ukraine is that economic interdependence doesn't mean that you won't get conflict. After all, Europe is Russia's primary destination for its exports, which provide about 50% of Russia's government revenue, yet we still have the situation that we have in the Crimea. And finally, just a brief thought on the domestic economic challenges that Christian rightly raised. Again, a lot that could be said, but alongside the economic challenges, about which we'll know more when the 4th plenum of the Chinese Communist Party takes place in October in Beijing, of course, are the social challenges and the doctrinal challenge. I think the interesting doctrinal challenge is what is going to come after Deng's dictum, observe calmly, hide our capabilities and bide our time. And I think we still don't know the answer about what's going to replace eventually that dictum. And finally, the social challenges, bring it back to the Cold War theme. I think one of the lessons that you see at the moment from President Xi's action of the reasons that the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War is that if you're going to do perestroika, economic reform, you certainly don't do glasnost at the same time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I need to bring this session to a close. Unfortunately, I think we could have gone on for another hour or so. These are huge topics, but I must thank our panelists for 3 excellent presentations, each of which was forthright in its own way, and I think this session very usefully carried forward the tradition that I think we've established at the Shangri-La Dialogue in recent years of frank and at the same time hopefully constructive discussion of Asia-Pacific security issues. So thank you, thank all of you very much.